Before I hand the microphone over to Alex, let me just mention very briefly both, I'll mention this tomorrow morning as well. We had invited Georgian Dream and government representatives to participate in the conference. They declined. So we're thrilled. Obviously, they wouldn't be on this panel in any event, but I did want to let everyone know that that was the situation. Once again, they declined. So without further ado, delighted to welcome back someone well known here in Georgia, Alexandra Hall, the former British ambassador to Georgia. Alex, over to you.
Thank you very much, David. And I'm going to stand up because I want to be able to see all my old friends and colleagues here today. I want to say how absolutely delighted I am to be back in Georgia, a country that I got to know well. And those of you who don't know me, I need to tell you I love this place and I care about this place. And all of us who are here and who have flown in on horrible overnight long flights care about Georgia. That's why we put ourselves through those long flights. And I think it's really disappointing that the Georgian government chose not to send representatives here, because this is a session talking about the future of Georgia with people who are patriots and love their country. And when you criticize a country, it is because you care about that country's future. And all of us who express concern about the future of Georgia are doing so not because we want Georgia to fail, but because we want Georgia to succeed. And it is doing civil society and the international community a disservice when we are accused of wanting Georgia to fail, because we all want Georgia to succeed. So in this session, I think we all know, and the EU in its 12 points has already set out very clearly some of the main areas where we still have concerns about Georgia's democratic trajectory and what it needs to do to fulfill the aspirations of its own people to integrate with the EU and with NATO. So I asked our colleagues here not to give a rehash of what all those individual issues are, but to use the fact that we have so many of the international community here to discuss what can we do about it. How do we get the right balance of incentives and encouragement to keep Georgia on its democratic path and stop the backsliding? So the first ingredient of a healthy democratic society is a healthy civil society. And I know that Georgian civil society has come under some pressure recently, including through the effort to pass the Foreign Agents Registration Act, the FARA Act, which was defeated through a very expressive campaign of opposition. So I want to start by asking our panelists, who I think are all very well known to you, but Eka, Keti, and Gia, first of all, tell us about the state of civil society here in Georgia. How open is the space for you now? Since that FARA law was defeated, what's been happening with civil society? Eka.
Okay. First of all, thank you for having the opportunity to speak on this panel. Yes, so what I want to say is that from one side, of course, we are active, motivated, patriots of this country. We are ready to fight until the end, and we really want for Georgia to get the status to integrate into EU and NATO, and this is what the civil society does now. So everything that we do, all the actions, all the decisions, all the discussions are about this. And we don't want to put this obligation to others, although we will speak about, what the international community should do about this. But, what we say is that we know that this is our fight. This is for our country, this is our cause, and we will fight for our country. From the other side, of course, we are in the situation when the civic space is shrinking. And you mentioned this law that the government wanted to adopt. There are a number of attempts also to undermine the reputation of particular NGOs, especially those who will be monitoring the elections in the future. So this is nothing new, right? So we all know what the authoritarian regimes, what the regimes where they don't want to have the independent voices does in different countries. And Georgia, unfortunately, is part of this trend.
So, thank you for that, Eka. Keti, can I turn to you? Can you give some more specific examples of the pressure that civil society is feeling? I mean, how does that work in practice? Because, I mean, one of the paradoxes of Georgia is certainly that when you come in here, and I was chatting to a colleague of mine, a former colleague of mine from the British Diplomatic Service, who's come from another country in the region, and says when you come here, it still feels a freer society. So what are the sort of specifics of what's the space in which you can operate, and in what ways do you feel constrained?
Actually, as the conference is dedicating to defeating Putinism, today I was thinking for myself, in reality now, civil society in Georgia is fighting Putinism, but inside our country. We cannot have, unfortunately, too much impact on the international world, but we are fighting Putinism because what we have seen, and I'll not be going to, too much in depth, but right after the start of war, if before that we were seeing appeasement from the side of government, of the Russian government, attempts not to be too critical or something. Now we see something that can already be called collaboration with the Russian regime. And what we see, we don't see direct pro-Russian propaganda from the government so far, but we see anti-Western propaganda. Anti-Western propaganda, and we see assaults on embassies, international players, European structures, and so on and so on. And attacks on civil society are actually a part of this. And this has not started only after the start of war, but has been strengthened after the start of war. So we could see the trends. The trends of attacking NGOs, verbally, still mostly verbally, talking about very wealthy NGOs, trying to also actually put a split in the civil society here, like telling small NGOs, you guys are good, but here, like Keti and others, are wealthy NGOs having all these resources and doing something against the country. It's also, as everything with this government, it's also very controversial and mutually exclusive, because on the one hand they say that they did send application, by the way, also with civil society, pressure for candidacy status, but right after receiving the candidacy status, they started, on the one hand, assaulting NGOs, assaulting European embassies, arresting media owners or managers, here they are, and so on. And many more steps which were done right after the application. So when they are fighting with us, whatever we can see, it's also the fight not just against the civil society, but something that we are struggling for, Georgia's European integration and Georgia's democratization, which we have been aspiring for, I don't know, for 30 years now,
Yes.
and never got to it.
So, Gia, perhaps I could come to you. Do you share that assessment that there has been a discernible shift? And if that's the case, what is the motivation, given that the Georgian people are so clearly desirous of moving further towards Euro-Atlantic institutions? Why would the government be taking this tack?
Yeah, okay, I agree that basically we have found ourselves in a completely different situation in the last couple of years. We have been moving in that direction for maybe 5 years, but after the beginning of the war, it sort of became crystal clear. And what it is. Okay, civil society was always kind of critical towards government. It was kind of part of identity of civil society. It's always unhappy, it's always pressuring government, you should do this and that. But at the same time, there was an assumption that when it comes to general goals of the country, we are on the same page. And that gave civil society some kind of pressure points that if you want to get association agreement, if you want to get visa regime, if you want now to get candidate status, you should do this. Otherwise, it contradicts this. And it worked sometimes at least. So there was this always difficult relations of criticism, sometimes confrontation, but also cooperation. And now this cooperation component is basically dead. There is no cooperation, unless on some small technical issues maybe, but when it comes to real important issues, including these 12 recommendations, basically government, you cannot pressure government that unless you do it, we don't get candidate status, because government's position is if we get status, fine. If we don't, also fine. Who cares, basically, right? So that's a new situation. And of course, as it was said, of course, neither government, nor previous one, nor before that, Shevardnadze's one, loved civil society, really. But I think this is the first one that openly says that civil society is an enemy. It's part of the war party. It's kind of, semi-criminal kind of group. So that's a new situation. So and that also means that we should rethink our tasks, because so far this tactic, civil society did lots of different things, but somehow that more visible part of civil society activities was this pressuring government and making it do certain things, which it was reluctant to do. But now it does not work, it does not make sense. So basically, this pushes us to refocus ourselves with broader public, because government does not care at all what civil society says. It fully ignores it, but it cannot ignore the public. It cannot ignore people in the street. So basically, now we have broader understanding of civil society, not just, these very competent organizations like us, but more like broader society. So, that's what government is actually scared of civil society going out of this bubble, as we say, of kind of small, relatively small organizations and going into the people. So I'm happen to be on advisory board of a new organization called Franklin Club, which is basically a organization which just teaches young people, high school kids or students, educates them in classical liberal values, and nothing else. It's purely educational projects, but government sees it as preparation for revolution. They fear any activism. So now somehow this greater focus is on activism, on broader activism.
Thank you. So I'm going to come back in a third round of comments about what we do to break this logjam looking forward to the 2024 elections. But I just want to pick up something you said, Gia, about candidate status and this worry that civil society and the Georgian people are no longer aligned with what the government is saying it wants to do, but may not actually in practice be fulfilling. It seems to me we have this sort of really catch-22 situation where there's a measure of doubt about the extent to which the government is truly committed to going forward with the necessary reforms, and yet it's saying it is, and as they said to Michael Carpenter today, they remain committed. And then there's a challenge for civil society, because on the one hand, I think, I'm guessing, and I certainly think the EU holds this view, that Georgia hasn't fulfilled the necessary criteria, and yet if Georgia doesn't get candidate status, does that play into a narrative that the EU and NATO don't really care about us and see they're fickle friends? Mm-hmm. So this is a real dilemma. So I kind of have a question, and I'll go back this way. What are the risks if Georgia does get candidate status, and what are the risks if it doesn't get candidate status? Because it seems to me there are risks either way.
Yes,
And how do we avoid those risks?
Yes, that's a very good question, very important question, and frankly, somewhat divisive question also within the civil society, because...
Do you support Georgia getting
Yeah,
candidate
because
status,
generally
even without the criteria?
Yeah, it's considered sort of unpatriotic to say
Of
that, not to say that we are strongly for getting candidate status right now, which is like in 2 months. And emotionally, probably we really feel like that. But on the other hand, it would be disingenuous to say that we deserve it, because if EU has its procedures, it says 12 recommendations. Did we fulfill it? Can we honestly say we did? We can't say honestly we did. So how can we say that we deserve it, right? So it's a very difficult situation, and of course government takes advantage of that, and it's not only will say that if we don't get it, that okay, the West wants us to draw into the war, and that's why it's not giving us a status, but it's also that opposition war party, meaning us as well, we are all lumped together, we sort of lobbied the West for not giving us the status. Right? So we all travel to the West and convince them, don't give status to Georgia. That's the narrative. So it will be used,
including the president
used against against us
Yeah.
in any way. But of course, if we do get the status, then the West came to its senses and after all appreciated it, and we deserved it, so we got it. So that will be the narrative.
So, Keti, I'll come to you. If the EU decision is favorable, how should it be presented in a way that it's not a concession that is pocketed and no real change happens? How should the decision be presented as an encouragement and a way to keep moving forward?
Yeah, I'll just add a couple of words before getting to this. Together with a group of NGOs, we started monitoring right after the 12 priorities were identified by European Commission. And the very first reaction from the government we got, it was exactly assaulting on us and saying that we are monitoring that to say something critical, and it's against Georgia, against Georgia's integration. We had just the opposite reception in Brussels when we were there, when the MPs were very much interested in the results. And it's interesting that mostly they coincided, not completely, but mostly because they're very similar to the EU Commission's, assessment, which came later. Anyway, when we were exactly meeting the European MPs, what we see is, yes, I would agree with Gia, we want this because this is an opportunity which comes very rarely, and we may be losing this opportunity for decades. Especially that right now, when I was listening to this conference, we are not mentioned. Though the conference is happening in Georgia, we are almost not mentioned because we are not anywhere now. We are not, the trio doesn't almost exist. When the trio, Georgia, Moldova, Ukraine was mentioned so often, it doesn't exist. We have horrible relations. The country and government has horrible relations with Ukrainian government instead of supporting them, and so on and so on. But we still have this opportunity to getting candidate status and then started to move to accession. That's why we ask European structures, give us the status, but identify very clearly the status is given to the Georgian people and Georgian society, and it has not been merited by the government. It could be a less strict, but there was something like this, I think in Bosnia's case, when it was identified that it was not the government. Because we know as soon as we receive, if we do receive the status, the government will say, see, we did everything to get it and we got it. And you guys did everything for us to put the obstacles, but you didn't succeed. So that's not good. That's why we want to be formulated very clearly. It could be like the text itself or whatever comes before it, but it should be said. Because according to our and EU assessments, only three priorities could be called either completely or mostly fulfilled. The rest still needs to be fulfilled, you know, especially some of the most important parts like depolarization or de-oligarchization and so on and so on.
Thank you. I actually was going to ask Eka precisely this question. I mean, some of the criteria are so strongly political. How do you depolarize and de-oligarchize? I mean,
Yes.
what is the threshold for that, and how is it to be done and measured?
Yes, so one of the recommendations is about the oligarchization, right? So, and our kind of way forward, I mean, I mean this for the number of civil society, so was that, okay, so if all other criteria will be met, then, you know, in fact, the oligarchization will happen because many kind of recommendations there were about the election of heads of the independent institutions, like, you know, some changes in the electoral legislation, judiciary, and so on. And in fact, if we would have many independent institutions and the heads will be independent, so like, you know, yeah, you can have the rich person in somewhere there, but like, you know, these institutions would not serve him, right? So that's the reality now, unfortunately, in Georgia. So that was kind of our opinion about all this. But I think that when talking about Georgia and whether Georgia met the criteria and what's the situation here, I think we should look at the whole history of Georgia from the moment we got the independence. And for the last 30 years, we guys had many achievements. I mean, we did like really, really unique reforms in this country, and these are really unique, you know, and many countries, even in our part of the world, try to have the same results and they can't reach it, you know, and we should not forget all the achievements that we had. And even like, you know, even in Moldova, for instance, they try to use the same kind of approaches that we used 15 years ago in this country, 18 years ago in this country. And this is like, you know, this is really because of the Georgians, because of the will of Georgians to build this country and to make this country better. So when asking whether we should get the status, yes, of course, because we worked hard, everyone, lots of people from civil society, from the public service, many people, many smart Georgians try to do their best to change this country. And you can't compare this country with the country we had, I don't know, 20 years ago. So that's why, of course, the conditions might be there. Of course, like, you know, all this is necessary for the European partners to tell us what is left. And then the negotiations of membership is coming, right? So that's also kind of a level that we should pass. But I think that this is very important to take into consideration. And yeah, not to forget the achievements of our country.
Thank you. That's a really good reminder. So earlier, one of the diplomats, the EU, former head of the EU mission to Ukraine, said there are sort of three core criteria. One is the political will, one is the administrative capacity to reform to meet the EU acquis, and the third one was the spirit of the people. And I don't doubt at all the spirit of the Georgian people. It's been so consistent and strong over the last 13, 15 years. I also believe Georgia has the administrative capacity as well. That's not in doubt. And as you said, many reforms have already been successfully implemented. So my last questions to you before I open it up is how do we energize the political will to keep going and tackle some of the hardest measures? And we have elections coming up next year. How do we help facilitate free and fair elections so that the will of the Georgian people is expressed? And what can the international community do? What should we be focusing on in the run-up to those elections? How can we support that?
Thank you for the great question. So I think that the international, again, saying that we all know that this is our fight. You know, we know the civil society and other people, we know that this is our fight, but really we will appreciate the, like, you know, the kind of assistance and the support from our Western friends, because defending democracy does not have the borders, right? So, like, you know, either we all defend democracy everywhere or not. So I think that it's very important to support democratic forces here in Georgia. Everyone, like, you know, starting with the small and civil society, as my colleague said, it's not only the NGOs. No, these are the small groups, even one person, like, you know, somewhere. I met so many, these wonderful people in different regions, like really every day defeating Putinism in our country, like every day. So, and we really, these people really need the support. We need to strengthen our independent media. You know, and this is, I should say, my concern, I should say, towards also to the donors community in Georgia. I'm sorry to say this, but our critical media needs the support, urgent support, because without them, it's impossible to talk with the people, to have this communication line. You should be strict and call everything its name, and really talk to the people. There is no time to speak behind the closed doors. It's important for the Georgian public and democracy defenders to know what's going on. We should, you should also, and the last thing, maybe, yeah, we need, of course, like, you know, if we talk about the elections, we need the long-term observation mission. This is very important for Georgia as well. But the most important thing is, again, to believe that Georgians can win this fight. This is very important for us. We can win this fight, I'm sure.
David, how much time do we have left? 15, okay. So I will give Keti and Geir a chance to comment on that, and then we'll open it for questions.
The same question, yeah?
Yeah.
Yeah, you know, I mean, I would agree with Eka that we need support and assistance, of course. I mean, the civil society in a larger way, the donors to be much more flexible than they used to be in our times, especially big donors. You know, we need young movements. You know, we are seeing lots of young movements developing now. Some of them are successful, some of them disappear. They need some special assistance. Of course, media, I mean, goes without saying, because mostly they are struggling. And that's why they come under political influences from one or the other side. But, I mean, we also need our partners to be very clear to the government that you either go this way or that way, because they are still as if going both ways. I mean, it's hard to say where they are more now. We see them more to be, I mean, closer to Russia than the EU, but they should be understanding that it should be, it's not just a game, and it's not just, they should choose the side. If not, they will not have any assistance. So, I mean, Georgian people really need support, because as it was mentioned earlier, if we don't see, for example, the same status and others, government has been working very hard on kind of making sure with people that they don't care for us, West doesn't care for us, so they will give us up. The second big thing is, but I don't know how to counter it, the government propaganda, and which is very close to Russian propaganda in every way, including the, I mean, global war party and so on. So we need to fight this propaganda, and it's not just responding. It's not just responding, we are not a global war party or something. Something very important is needed from this side to kind of respond. Not just telling people that, I mean, West is good and Europe is good, which we are also trying to do, but reaching out to larger public much more. I mean, on the one hand, countering this actually Russian propaganda, which is slightly, reformed here, and then creating, I mean, the actual positive propaganda of the only choice of Georgia, because the only choice for Georgia is West.
Right. So I've heard you say a number of times this really important message about the international community getting its messaging right. So supporting civil society, supporting Indian media, but being very clear in its messaging to the Georgian people and the Georgian government. Because if this is a moment for Georgia, it's also a moment for us to step up as well. Gia, do you want to add a couple of thoughts on that? And then we'll have just a brief couple of questions.
Yeah, very briefly, I agree basically with what Eka and Keti just said. Of course, I think we have the same assumption that whether or not we get candidate status, we are stuck, basically, politically, because there is no political will to go in that direction to make Georgia a really European country. So there will be no progress without political change, and next year elections are crucial for that. That sort of, we take it for granted, we understand that. I think Georgian society generally has capacity to achieve the result of change, but it will not be easy to achieve. And of course there is importance of critical media, but I think the greatest impediment, greatest problem on the society side is some kind of sense of disillusionment, sense of kind of apolitical mood and that's sort of indirectly encouraged by the government. I think government propaganda is a little bit like Russian propaganda in that sense. It's not that we are good, it's that everybody is bad. And of course, so we may be a lousy government, but look at the opposition. You know, they are good for nothing. So that's basically the narrative, which works to some extent, right? So, and that's also our job as civil society to somehow convince them that, okay, you know, in some other countries there are no perfect politicians, and sometimes you are not fully sure that somebody you vote for is perfect and great, but you have to make the right choice anyway. And there is this civic responsibility. I think that's that pragmatic mood, if you wish, is something that we are lacking. We are very romantic people. We are not pragmatic by our nature. We like revolutions. We don't like, you know, day-to-day work so much. So I think we have to work on this with different key groups in the society, young people especially, because young people are great at protesting, but lousy at voting, as in many places, and that's very big problem, very big challenge.
Sure.
If I could just add with something I forgot, something that we cannot do as civil society, but international donors and some institutions like NDI could do, help the political parties to create smart coalitions, because it's very difficult now in this country. I mean, on the one hand, the governing party doesn't have so much support, 25 to 30, yeah, I mean, differently. But the others have even much less, even if you add them up currently, you know, and this saying that it's a general public saying also, yeah, this government is no good, but what's opposition about? So if some of the institutions which have legitimately this right help them create some smart oppositions so that they really start to have like govern at least some sectors of not govern, I mean get support of some sectors of society, this would be very important. If not, we would be stuck with this government.
Right, thank you.
In spite of all our European aspirations.
I like Gear's point about making sure it's not so difficult that people sort of feel disillusioned and then they feel there's no point in trying. It can be done, as you said, Eka. This is not impossible. Countries have done it in far more difficult circumstances. And I suspect the UK will be learning from you when we reapply in 20 years' time or whenever we get to that point.
Maybe we would be joining together again.
I hope so. So I'm actually, given the time, I'm going to take 4 questions, and then you can each have a comment or an answer. So I see the lady on the right here. I see 1, 2, 3, 4. So, yes. Thank you.
Thank you. Salome Samadashvili, Member of Parliament, former Georgian ambassador to the European Union. What I want to say that the EU enlargement is about the project of transformation. And the Georgian citizens actually want the EU candidacy or the EU membership because they want to live in the country which is run by the government, which is not corrupt, which serves their interests, and which delivers for their citizens. So when we're talking about the potential dilemmas that the decision of the candidacy is presenting to the Georgian citizens, actually what I would be worrying about is all these Georgian citizens, which are the majority in this country, you know, over 50% for sure, who believe that this government does not serve them right, who believe that they are run by authoritarian, pro-Russian, corrupt government. And that if the EU's decision is taken by this government in order to deprive the Georgian citizens even further of their electoral rights and stay in power despite the fact that the majority of the citizens do not want them to run this country, and we have seen it in the last elections, which were conducted on the verge of legitimacy. I think that there will be more Georgian citizens disappointed in the European Union if the candidate status were not to be granted. So whatever decision the European Union crafts, and it's a difficult situation indeed, it has to be the decision which will empower the Georgian citizens vis-à-vis the corrupt, authoritarian, pro-Russian government, and not the decision which will disempower the citizens of this country even further. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. That's not really a question, but a very
It's a comment.
powerful comment. I'm going to use the prerogative of sitting in the chair to say one of the arguments I used to have with my Georgian friends here all the time is, and we've got into the trap of framing this entire discussion about EU integration. And one of the things I used to say to my Georgian friends all the time, don't do it to please us. This is when we were in the EU as well, of course. Don't do it to please us. Do it because you want it for yourselves. And that these aren't tick boxes. They're things you intrinsically want for your own society to be, whether or not you get into the EU. There is that trap that it's all framed around EU integration. Yes. Hello.
Oh.
Could we have the microphone over here, please? Thank you.
Thank you. Gigauri Baramidze, UNM. Welcome, Alexandra. It's very good to see you again back in Georgia. I am representing the main political opposition party of this country. And we all know that our leader, President Saakashvili, is in jail, and he's indeed in terrible situation. Numerous times, even by the recently elected, selected and elected by the government and by the majority ombudsmen, consilium have confirmed that his situation, his health is deteriorating. So he's slowly dying. But thanks God, he's morally and emotionally back and is trying to fight. But his party, United National Movement, is suffering a lot. We all talk about not revolution, Gia said. Yes, I'm one of the leaders of the Rose Revolution, but we are not dreaming now and striving for the next revolution. We want smooth transition, as we have done in 2012, civilized way, which will help Georgia further increase our speed toward the EU membership and NATO membership, not to go back. But talking about election, how do we think, can the next election, whatever it will be, I mean, all these difficulties, let's say we have somehow overcome this unfair Central Electoral Commission interference of the prosecutors, criminal, and so on and so forth. Can it be considered fair when the major leader, main leader of the main opposition party sitting in jail? I just, 30 seconds I'll say. I remind everybody, prior to 2012 elections, our government did very stupid things. We changed the constitution in order to let Bidzina Ivanishvili, French citizen, to participate in this election and even become a member of government. It was not without pressure from our friends, but it's okay. We did it. We changed the constitution. But now our leader is sitting in jail. How it can be considered as a free election? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I'll take just one more. Did you want to ask one? And could you keep it short? And thank you. The question was about how can we have free elections when Saakashvili is still in jail, leader of one of the parties.
My question will be about the candidate status and about the consensus and how do you reach consensus among civil society organizations, the whole pro-Western forces in Georgia. Because my impression, I recently visited Brussels several times, my impression is that there are differences, there are different voices heard from Georgia there. Some say almost, I'm oversimplifying, that no conditions, it would be a great catastrophe if we don't get the status, so give us the status. And the other opinions are more, let's link it to the elections. I heard one of the options, this Bosnian scenario, but personally, I think first it's very difficult to have this language adopted by the council. And second, what did this Bosnian scenario, how it impacted on Bosnia? Is the situation in Bosnia much better now? So personally, I think the elections, it could be the issue that could be raised together by all opposition and civil society together. And it gives this option, if it is consensual, a much better chance to be then repeated by the EU. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So the elections being a critical factor, and how does civil society speak with one voice? Okay, do you want to each say a few words on any of those points?
Maybe I'll respond to Guillaume. And I agree. Unfortunately, none of us mentioned this, that it kind of goes this way, that we are not talking so much about this issue. But we had a démarche of European ambassadors, concerning the Saakashvili issue. And with the NGOs, we have disseminated a number of appeals. In this case, calling for humanitarian transfer of President Saakashvili to one of the European clinics or so on. And by the way, it's interesting, when we were making the first appeal, only a couple of NGOs joined. But with time, it's more and more, you know. You understand it's not a very easy issue, and it's not a very easy issue for Georgians. And unfortunately, the government is also using these attitudes, and negative attitudes, they are still kept in this country against, your party and against Misha's dismissal. But I would agree in general terms that we cannot have really democratic elections and peace in this country, because we're constantly told that we need peace in this country, while having the former president in prison and in very bad conditions, and these conditions getting worse and worse. As for elections, you guys.
Okay, I will maybe also follow on this consensus. Tornika used the word consensus several times. It's very difficult to have consensus on anything in Georgia, including
civil society,
including within Georgian civil society. So, as I understood his attitude, it's better to have consensus on something that really matters, right? To kind of focus our consensus building skills on something that really matters. And in that sense, I agree that elections are the most important, the key issue. And here I think we need consensus that election matters. When I mentioned revolution, etc., I am not saying that there is some party which calls for revolution, but there is this mood in the society that elections will not be fair anyway, so We cannot change this government through elections, so every time I write on Facebook something about elections, somebody comes, you know, you still believe that you can change government through elections, you are so naive, something like that, and that's a big issue, big problem, of course. And people who say that, they are maybe strongly anti-government, but this narrative is good for government, that elections do not make any sense. So, and I think we should agree that yes, it's scandalous that former president and leader of the opposition party is in jail. Of course, it makes general electoral environment unfair, but it's not the only one that makes electoral environment unfair. We don't expect these elections to be fair, unfortunately. We should be realistic, but I think we can still realistically believe that under the circumstances it still can be won. I think that's at least my understanding, that this is a right position to have, that we live in a society, and it's not only now, in a political system where you know, government has always starts a game with a handicap in its favor, right? But if society is mobilized enough, it can overcome that handicap. And that happened in our history, and we can make it happen again.
Okay, so yes, I agree. So, I mean, I'm representing the organization which monitors the election, and we know all the details and all the violations and all the kind of techniques and everything that the government is doing during the elections. So, I personally, of course, I don't expect that they will wake up in the morning saying that, okay, now we should behave well. So no, of course. I mean, of course they will continue doing everything that they were doing during the previous years, abusing these administrative resources, threatening, intimidation, everything that they were doing. But, I mean, again, so what we should do, we Georgians should do, and everyone, all the groups who are involved in elections, what we should do, we should cooperate, coordinate, and do everything to resist to all this. And this is in our hands. This is very important to know. Otherwise, definitely, there will be this fact, the president in the prison, but also some other things that will, of course, make the assessment of the elections more complicated, right? So, and again, in all this, it is very important to, again, to my opinion, to get the status, and I don't know, like, you know, yeah, maybe there are some NGOs and the civil society representatives who have different arguments. I don't have problems with this, but what I am saying, and my colleagues and those who are cooperating all the time, is that it's definitely important to get the status. Definitely it's important, as Keti said, to have the right communication from the side of the EU to strengthen the pro-government groups here, to motivate them and to make them stronger, to resist to what is coming before the elections.
Pro-government groups?
Thank you. I'm going to end it there.
No.
I just want to end by clarifying that the point of a free and fair election isn't that one side or the other wins. We're not on one side or the other. It's about allowing a channel for proper expression.
We just like the change.
Yeah. So, but we're not in that political space. Thank you very much. That was really great. Eka, Keti, and Gia, thank you so much.
Thank
And
you.
Alex, thank you very much. Great moderating. You know, a lot of us who come here often fall in love with this country, and it's the wonderful people here, and 3 perfect representatives of that up on the stage. Alex, thank you for the moderating.